is the Archivest, y'all, exclusively interviewing Charlie Ahearn.
We're chilling.
Yes, it's an honor to interview you.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Ahearn.
Thank you.
And who is Charlie Ahearn?
Charlie Ahearn was born in 1951 with a brother, John Ahearn. We're identical. We were born in June 13th of 1951. I'm from Binghamton, which is upstate New York. I've been living in New York since 1973, and I have been working as an artist there since I first moved to New York in '73, and I got involved in a kind of artwork that was community-based and related to going outside of the normal art channels to work out what you might call in the street, or I thought of it as going to housing projects and setting up things where I would shoot some films and then come back the following weekend. I would shoot on a 16 millimeter film camera and come back with a projector and show the film on the wall to people as a way to get their reaction and to set up a dialogue with people. And one of the things that I did that stands to mind was that I went into this, it was a gymnasium in the Smith Projects, which is just north of the Brooklyn Bridge. And I remember that it was, I would say it was the summer of '77, or maybe late spring of '77. And I had been moving around that general area and shooting film of people. And at this point I walked in, it was in the nighttime, and let's say it was like 10 o'clock at night, and I was hearing James Brown music from outside, and I went inside, and I remember Soul Power was being repeated. The phrase Soul Power was being repeated by a DJ, and I remember seeing lines of guys facing each other, which to me looked positively tribal and not like what I was used to, guys dancing with guys in lines. And they were kind of dropping in unison, and I'm not going to, try to redo it for you here because I'm not a dancer, but basically they were doing something that what you would call up-rocking, kind of like a version of up-rocking, but I had no idea of what it was or why the music sounded like this. And I shot film of them dancing, and then I came back the following weekend and threw it up on a screen there and showed it to people. I was interested in getting reactions from people, and at one point in came a whole troop of kids, walked into the screening room with an older guy, and who introduced himself as Nathan Ingram. And he was there because he said this was their martial arts school, and they were interested in making a movie with me. They wanted to know would I work with them on a film. And I was, of course, right away I was ready to drop anything that I had had previous to that point as an idea. And I said, yeah, I would love to work on a film with them. And because right at that point, I was involved in new technology that was coming around the bend, which was Super 8. And the cool thing about Super 8 that separated it from 16 millimeter was that it had a little sound stripe on it. And the sound stripe meant that when you were shooting, in a sense it was like video, so that you were recording sound simultaneously with one camera. Previous to that, production meant double system. You had a guy with the sound, all this stuff, and it meant a crew of people. And I had always been working as an artist myself with a camera, but this meant that you could, in a sense, shoot something dramatic with people yelling or music playing or whatever. And it was sort of a perfect storm between their interest in making a martial arts movie and my interest in exploring a narrative movie which had all the shouts and dramatic things that you get in a real movie. I was like, okay, now it's time to make a real movie with these kids. What kind of movie do they want to make? And so I became very interested in the whole thing that was going on with martial arts movies at that time, which is the mid-70s. Bruce Lee died in like 1973, I believe, and his ghost was everywhere as a kind of mentor, as a kind of spiritual example of empowerment, restraint, spirituality, and physical strength to overcome anything that would be in your way. This is a great example to people. The fact that he was dead, in a sense, increased his legend, and it made him a kind of spectral myth, a legend, which drove a lot. And these kids were all fantasizing, what that meant to them. And I was fascinated that when I went to 42nd Street, I began to go to 42nd Street all the time. And I would be in a theater filled with Black and Latino kids, and they would be watching a Chinese martial arts movie and yelling at the screen and talking about the style of the screen and what's going on. And I was just like, to me, it was like a film festival of the street. And this was my intro to what I thought was the guts of street culture at that time for me. Now you have to understand that at that time, graffiti was so ubiquitous that it was almost hard to see it because it was so surrounding everything that was out there. If you went out into the street, there were graffiti tags, hits everywhere. The subways were covered. And that was a different kind of street, obviously, art that was at the very heart of what it was at that moment. And I happened to be very lucky because where I was shooting this martial arts movie in the Smith housing project happened to be where Lee Quinones was from. And it just happens that Lee Quinones was the very most powerful and most respected subway graffiti artist in New York City. Now, people are going to be whatever you say. So I'm not here to argue with people, but I just know from a lot of experience talking to people, the dude gets much respect to this day from almost everybody that was out there. And I didn't know who he was, but his artwork was all over Smith projects. It was in the room where I shot those kids dancing. It was in the gymnasium, that is what I mean. And it was outside in the housing project on the handball courts. And this guy was developing a kind of art style that combined the strongest elements of pop art with letters and words done in graffiti style, which was extremely powerful and funny at the same time. And I thought he was the greatest artist in New York. And I was shooting these martial arts scenes around his handball court. And I would see like kids and I'd be like, who is this guy? And they'd be like, Lee. Like, of course, don't you know who he is? He's the most famous artist in New York. And I'd be like, well, where is he? And they'd be like, I don't know. And then one day, while I was shooting a scene of the martial arts movie, and we're talking right now about the summer of '78, which is a year later from the first scene that I told you about. Lee, I didn't know him, but this skinny kid, came in a handmade scooter that he had made, a motorized scooter. and he comes roaring down the park in this handmade scooter, and he's got a huge afro and, you know, a t-shirt and sneakers. That's about it. And I introduced myself to him, and I told him how much of a big fan I was. And I said, I really would like to work with you on this film. And he was like, bet. That's all he said. And I'm like, well, how can I meet you? How can we do this? He goes, I'll be around. And then he goes, phew, scoots off. A whole year goes by. I don't know where this guy lives or anything. And that was very, like, it placed in me this sort of like mystery, which to fill in some of the other gaps, I would say that I was working at that time with a group of other artists that were interested in breaking out of the art world familiar areas and working. Like, some of the people were going to the South Bronx and doing art projects in the South Bronx. Other people were going into other areas. There was a kind of openness right at that moment to redefining what artwork was and who the audience was, etc. All these people got together in a collective called Collab, like collaborative artists, and they started a art show that was going to be held in the middle of Times Square, which was not a place art ever even thought of going. And you got to understand, Times Square at that time was like prostitutes, total drug dealing, martial arts movies, etc. That was Times Square at that moment. It was dangerous at night there. But that was the whole idea, was to try to bring a huge art show, which happened in June of 1980 at what was called, there was the very nexus of 42nd Street and Broadway, which was where this show took place. And it was 3 stories in a building of an abandoned massage parlor. And massage parlor was like, you know, instant sex, like, you know, happy ending massage parlor. And there was artists streaming in, hanging their work. My twin brother, John Ahearn, Tom Otterness was showing work there, Kiki Smith, Jane Dixon was showing her work there. These are all artists that I've done other projects with. Jean-Michel Basquiat came and he tagged other people's work. He wrote the words "free sex" over the front door. He made an abstract painting on the 3rd floor where they were hanging their fashion stuff, and he painted it on the wall, and I've seen photographs of that, and it looks a lot like the kind of painting that he became known for a year later, which sounds like nothing, but at Nose Taste is a long time. It was work that he had not done at that moment. Keith Haring came in and did work on the walls, and Kenny Scharf did stuff, and it got on the front page of the Village Voice. Art in America did a story. In other words, this was considered the watershed art moment of artists that were coming in, not just artists from downtown moving uptown, but artists from the Bronx were coming in. You know, people like Fab Five Freddy, who was really known as Fred Brathwaite at that time. Fab Five Freddy came there to the Times Square show wanting to hang his work and to find Charlie Ahearn, because he had been in Lee's neighborhood talking to Lee about trying to make a break into the art world with this graffiti art. And he thought this could be the moment to do it. So he came looking for me because he wanted to talk to me about how to get into the show, and also about ideas of how, you know, wouldn't it be cool to make a movie that would connect the rap scene with the graffiti scene. And he approached me there, and he had, you know, dark sunglasses on, tall, handsome guy, very mysterious. And we talked for like a long time there. And the main thing that I kept saying to him was, so you know Lee, right? And he was like, yeah, I know Lee. And I said, well, bring Lee here tomorrow. In a way, it was a test to see if he was for real. And I said, if you can bring Lee here tomorrow, I'll get you some paint and you can do a big piece on the outside of the building. And he was very excited about that. And the next morning he brought Lee and they did a Fab 5 piece. And you can even figure out, you can look at it and see which piece was Lee's and which was Fred's. I think the Fab piece was Lee's and the 5, I think, was Fred's. And because it had this kind of crudeness to it. And that was like the first thing that I did to make Wildstyle, because once we were together at that moment, I was in a sense acting as the producer, and Fred was acting as the connecting person, and Lee was acting sort of as the subject matter, in a sense. You could, in a sense, make this triangle, and that was the basis of making the movie Wildstyle.
And the MTA subway yards, 5 points, speak on some of your classic memoirs that you recall. Is the Wiz, Don D, Sen 1, Lee, Tacky 183, Julio 204.
The first thing that I wanted to say about what was happening on the subways is that I was very fortunate in that I think the summer of 1980 was one of the great explosions of writing on the subways. And the whole historical nature of what was going on was much harder to perceive at that point. And people perceive history as they live it. And my viewpoint at that time was, let's say, I had the perspective of being very much there during the summer of 1980 in terms of knowing the players, the writers on the subway, and seeing a complete amazing sort of flowering of various whole car art forms developing right at that point. Futura did his brakes car. Dondi did his, Children of the Grave car. Lee did a whole series of like outstanding cars during that same time. There were many writers that the ambition had gotten so great that there were whole cars rolling out almost every day on the system. And if you were there to watch it, it was like one of the greatest art shows that this country has ever produced in terms of its creativity. And it was hard to tell, was this just going to keep getting bigger and bigger, and where was this all going? And thank God there were, Marty and Henry were there to really document it professionally, so that we can look back with a certain amount of distance and see like a whole picture of it. And when you go back in time and see, now we can go back to other books that were produced both retroactively, but also there was like the Faith of Graffiti book, which came out in 1973, of John Mayer's photographs that were photographed in like 1972. And those were, like the pioneering days, the moment when styles hadn't been invented yet, and people like Phase 2 were creating bubble style letters, and letters were being stretched out to fill up the whole space, going right up to the windows, to the bottom. They called that window downs. The window downs that were filled in. And then when people got really crazy, you had Stay High, and he had letters going right from the top to the bottom, and he had like his little His little character with the halo over on one side. And that whole thing was called a top to bottom. If you had to fit your piece from top to bottom and from side to side, called a whole car. And those things got pioneered during the early 70s. And it's not for me right now to go into depth because this would take a long time. And I don't pretend to be the expert of this particular form, but I'm an incredible fan in the sense that I have, done my diligence respecting the pioneers and really looking at what it took to produce the generations that came later. Jack Stewart is a photographer who came in the next generation in 74 and 75. Jack Stewart came in and was picking up where John Mayer had left off and produced a body of work which really helped get the early blades and get like the early Lee Quinones cars, and thank God for what Jack Stewart did. And there's a great book out about Jack Stewart's work as well.
Incredibly fruitful and explosive time for a whole generation that really got very ambitious to do whole cars in their own styles, like Fab Five Freddy did his Campbell Soup car. This is all around the same time, so you really had whole cars rolling through the system on a weekly basis. Some of the pioneer stuff done by a number of people in the early 70s, which set the stage for the future generations. In graffiti, generation is like 3 years, because kids started often doing graffiti when they were, let's say, 14, 15, and a lot of kids would age out by the time they were like 18. It's a very short period, and new kids would see it and pick up on it, and older kids would mentor younger kids. So you had like a new generation coming in, let's say in the early mid 70s. They were identifying with the earlier writers, but making more ambitious statements and more ambitious in terms of numbers of whole cars that they wanted to make. And they were also part of large crews, like Blade had his own crew, and Lee had the Fabulous Five, which of course later was attached to Fred Brathwaite, but Fabulous Five crew of Lee goes back years before Fred's involvement, and was, writers like Slave and Mono and Doc, who actually were out writing before Lee, and they brought Lee in as a kid into their crew, and so you have generations mentoring younger kids, and so that by the time I was really looking at it and documenting it, which is the summer of 1980, there was like another generation growing up during that time and making statements on the subways, and who knew where it was going, and at that time what was going to happen next. The time that we shot Wildstyle was in the summer of 1981, and there was a different group of trains running then as the summer before that, because the life at that time, because they were erasing trains, putting them through the buffer machine, which was all this chemical acid, trains didn't last more than a couple of weeks, compared to, let's say, in the early 70s, they might go for years. So there was a lot of competition, a lot of turnover. Called the Alfred E. Smith Housing Projects, which was where I met Nathan Ingram, and he and his Kung Fu school, which was actually called the Deadly Art of Survival School, which I used as the name of the film, which I made in Super 8 during the time of early 1978 period, and I actually showed that film all over Europe in the fall of 1978, and I brought it and showed it in Amsterdam, in Paris, in Berlin, in Warsaw, Poland. Think of that in 1978. Because people had no idea of what all this represented at that time.
And 43rd and 8th Ave, and then Manhattan.
Well, 43rd and 8th Ave was where I set up shop. I moved. I was living with Jane Dixon, an artist, and we later got married. Before all that happened, in 1980, we moved to Times Square. I was completely focused on Times Square as a sort of center of street culture because of the kung fu movies, and because in a way hip hop as a culture was really all over Times Square really at that time. You could see it, the crews out on the street. Kids that were into breakdancing at the time were going to see kung fu movies, and they were being inspired by things that they saw on the screen in kung fu movies and making up their own movies. The thing that they call the windmill, in a sense, is like a kung fu move of like monkey style. If you want to go see a Mad Monkey kung fu movie, for instance, and you'll see lots of that.
And doing time in Times Square, the collab.
Well, the thing was is that I moved with the person that was to be my wife. Jane Dixon and I were both involved in the Times Square show, and she was working at the Spectacular sign in Times Square, which is where I met her and got to know her, right on 42nd Street, and she worked on the Spectacular sign with people like Keith Haring, and many other really notable, interesting artists. We both wanted to live in Times Square, and I wanted to set up shop, an office that was going to produce Wildstyle. And I thought, what better place than 8th Avenue and 43rd Street, which was sort of the epicenter, not only of street culture, but also the film center. All the film labs were on 42nd and 43rd Street, and the editing systems were all there. In other words, that was where, if you're going to make a movie about street culture, that was the capital right there. So I moved there, and Jane and I got married in 1983, and as things progressed, she started to make paintings of Times Square that became known worldwide, of what the street scenes look like up and down 8th Avenue. We had a son, Joe, that came in 1986. When after his birth, I got a video camera. And I was a very light sleeper, as I still am now. And I would hear noises out in the middle of the night. I would hear all kinds of things. Not only sirens, but people shouting, yelling, arguments, fights going on, music going out. This is, what it was like on 42nd Street in the early 80s, late 80s. It was street culture, but it was also transvestites out in the street, throwing garbage cans at police cars, and a lot of hell breaking loose. And I would tend to open up. We had these windows that would open sideways like this, and stick my head out the window to see what was going on, and take that video camera that I got from my son's birthday to record his comings and goings. And I started shooting stuff out the window. And after years of this, it started to dawn on me that this accumulation of detail, of daily stuff going on outside my window, was a real document of an era that was changing very rapidly. Things were shutting down in Times Square. Times Square was changing, and there was a document of what street culture really meant at that time. People selling drugs, prostitutes, transvestites. I mean, I've already gone into it, but also just stuff also that happened during the daytime that you wouldn't imagine. That it does not look like that now. If you went there right now, you would think that it was a totally different city. So I made a movie out of this home movie material and called it Doing Time in Times Square. And anyone that knows street culture knows that doing time is what you do in prison. And if you're doing time, it means that you are in a certain area for a long period of time. And I thought by the movie, you would look out and you would see other people out there, and we're all doing time is the point of the movie. Everyone was there in a kind of closed universe, or so it seemed from looking at the people, looking out their windows, and etc.
Before it was all made, could you elaborate on the challenges of the film from 1981 to 82 before it premiered?
The challenges were primarily that I had a lot of ambitions, and I had never gone to film school, and I never had any film training. And it shows. Anyone can look at the film and see the sort of primitive nature of it, that I don't know a lot of things that people would take for granted that had gone to NYU. I was very ambitious, and it was for a purpose. Fred and I talked a lot about what was going on, and the sense that this was a kind of new era that we were witnessing, and that I felt like we had the responsibility of getting it right. I didn't want to do like a Sugar Hill Gang kind of thing. It wasn't about making a movie. It was really about putting people on that were pioneers. It was about giving shine to the proper people, and also being surrounded by the talent that you had absolute trust in. And in a way, I felt having Lee at the center of this thing really gave me an enormous amount of confidence, because I trusted that he really was the man, and who was sort of at the forefront of this whole subway movement. And I felt that the people that I was in touch with from the Bronx in terms of MCs and DJs, these were people that I had no doubt by the time I was making the film who were like people that were real talents. And I had an enormous amount of confidence with the Cold Crush Brothers, Busy Bee. I just felt that basically my job was to set it in motion, to create a frame, to create a certain kind of narrative that would hold people's attention, but not to let the narrative get in the way of what was the real issue here, which was, people witnessing this culture. And that was always right at the forefront, except watching the thing actually happen. And to me, that was exactly how to make a movie. It's not a documentary movie, excuse me. A lot of people say, oh, I love your documentary. Well, it's not a documentary movie in any real sense, but it documents real life in the sense that it's giving people the 5 minutes or the 2 minutes to really do what they do best and to show what I thought they were most capable of. And I was very, very strong on trying to really highlight talent in a way that gave them the most clear way to show who they were to the public, and so that when people saw this movie in Japan, or people saw this movie in Germany, in Berlin, they had no measuring stick. They had nothing to compare it to. But that's a huge responsibility for us to get it right. There was a lot of bullshit that people were trying to make money
I won't even go into it. But there was a lot of people that came on the culture and tried to make a lot of money fast and created stuff that really is embarrassing. And I'm not saying Wildstyle isn't corny. It does have its corny moments. But I do feel like I represented the people in a way that is respectful to like Grandmaster Caz and gave people like Theodore a chance to scratch mix. And I really wanted, you know, you have that scene of Flash in his kitchen. People could see the real people that made this, that in a sense invented these things that we're going to see. And so did I get everybody? No, I didn't. I'm not. This was never seen as a historic, in that sense, document. I wasn't trying to tell the history of hip hop. Later, I did this book called Yes, Yes, Y'all, because people thought when I went places with Wildstyle, because of their naivete, they thought of it as a kind of history of hip hop or some kind of, and I would be, no. It really goes back. This is like a moment in history. It's a slice of time. It was that moment, you know, in 1980, and we tried when we produced the music, like Fred worked with me to produce an album of breakbeats, and the whole idea was we didn't want drum machines. We weren't going into planet rock, and which was happening right at that moment, but we wanted to go back and create a moment in time with that fat back drum sound that's like a kind of James Brown feeling that you get in the music that was being cut up by DJs at that time. So it's a kind of conservation of culture for that moment. But it was also projecting where we all wanted it to go. Like what you see at the amphitheater, I never saw. The amphitheater, which happens at the end of the movie, where you see a collection of individuals, you see Lee's mural outside the building, and you see, you know, Rocksteady crew on, you know, on the stage breakdancing to DST, scratch mixing, etc. I had never seen all that in one piece anywhere, but it was a concept. You know, the movie is a concept of expressing what everyone felt at the time, but didn't necessarily exist all in one space. So it wasn't a documentary. It did sell out. It was on 47th Street and Broadway, which was a kind of vision that we always had for the movie, that we thought it should come back to the place where we had, you could have seen Kung Fu movies in this theater if you had come the year before. So I'm saying this was the Times Square era of movies where you had raw action flicks, you know, Charles Bronson movies there, or Kung Fu. This was the hardcore movie theater in Times Square where all that stuff was shown. And when we went out during the time of this movie's release, I was imitating the kind of street hustle of DJs from the Bronx who would go out on Thursday and Friday afternoons and get the young guys out there with sacks of flyers and hit every high school. We hit every high school in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, and the Bronx every Thursday and Friday out there, and that was our core audience that came and they saw who was there and they were like, Busy Bee? What? They had only heard of Busy Bee on cassette, but they knew who he was. Grandmaster Flash, everyone knew who he was because Flash was a superstar at that moment. Fab Five Freddy, by the time of the film's release, Fab Five Freddy's name, because of Blondie, was known, did Rapture. That created a household
name out of Fab Five Freddy, and we were people like, Fab Five who? What is that, a Fab Five? What does that mean? But it created curiosity. And Fred, this was way before, years before Fred was on Yo MTV and became known for that. But he was sort of in the back of people's minds, and I'm talking high school students now. We're not talking about downtown, the downtown club scene and stuff like that, the Mud Club and the Roxy and all that. That was starting to really happen, and Fred would be known in those circles. But we're talking about bringing high school kids to a movie theater, and that is one of the hardest things to do. But we did it in spades. It was the second highest grossing movie in New York City in the opening weekend, second to Terms of Endearment, which was a big Hollywood film. And this is a movie that was like made in 16 millimeter with, I would say, without anybody really in any principal role that had ever made a movie before, perhaps, unless you count the stuff like The Deadly Art of Survival, which is not, you can't.
From the mid-'80s through the next decade, let us know more on the history of the street culture, hip-hop culture that you've witnessed, and what were you doing?
It's, we're talking about 32 years now, and it would be exhaustive to get into what happened, because if I could do it in a thumbnail sketch, I would say that Wildstyle was the opening salvo of a kind of media attention to hip-hop, and people, because the movie went out not only across the United States, some places it went to, like Chicago bombed. It was like the coldest day they'd ever had in Chicago, and it was like Super Bowl or something, and it's like crash. Philadelphia sold out for 6 weeks in Philadelphia. That was because Philadelphia was the graffiti capital next to New York City, and that was our sister city, or brother, we should call it a brother city. Philadelphia was our brother city, both in terms of hip hop, but especially graffiti culture really originated in Philadelphia. And those guys were heads. They knew, when they saw Wildstyle, they identified with that movie. Other places thought it was some kind of science fiction or whatever it was. So it was, believe it or not, the first place that Wildstyle was shown before Times Square was in Tokyo, in Japan. It was brought there at a time when no one knew anything about the culture, and hip-hop began to be seen in all these places, began to be imitated by kids, sometimes in hilarious ways, but identifying with the culture as something that you could do. You could pick up a spray can, you could practice breakdancing in your living room, you could, all these things were within the possibility, and you could look at a movie like Wildstyle and sort of check it out and say, oh yeah, I think I could try to write some of those rhymes, that sounds like fun. And it happened in different languages, and it became something that people identified with. And I think the reason why it was so successful, because it was a kind of blueprint. It didn't tell you what you had to do, but it gave you a structure in which you could bring your own music as background music, or your own language to rap in, etc. So it spread, and the fastest growing aspect of hip hop, which is hard to understand right now, but it was very obvious, was b-boying, because b-boying did not have any language that someone in Italy could watch a movie with b-boys in it, and they could talk about b-boys in Italian and understand this is what kids look like, this is what they do in New York. And b-boy crews were traveling around the world
appearing before the Pope, going to Russia to, they were, by 1986, B-boys had so traveled around the planet and were in McDonald's commercials. By 1987, they were played out. Graffiti had this other wave in which it became so much of a rage after this, that galleries around the world started wanting to find out who the next artist would be that they could get into their gallery, and graffiti artists started moving to Rome, to France, Belgium, and setting up shop and becoming the New York artists and having careers. And some of them still are there to this day. And it was very good for them. But that wave did not go on forever. In other words, by the end of the 80s, there was a sense of exhaustion that set in. People became skeptical over the whole thing. DJs were forgotten about, It was all about selling rap records, and the whole thing was a business and an industry, and a lot of what we think of as hip-hop, I would say, had disappeared by the end of the 80s. It was true. And it only really came back, in my mind, with people like Nas, who were only sort of shouting out to people. Nas did a record called Illmatic, which he had an opening track called Genesis. It was about him stacking the Benjamins, and it was about him being a hustler. But the background of it had to do with culture and had to do with recognizing what they're talking about was they're playing the theme song from Wildstyle. And they're talking about, no man, this is the genesis, this is where it all came from. And so we see people going back, smart people, interesting people were sampling bits of the movie to use in their own records, or the Beastie Boys were making hilarious spoofs of early hip-hop. They loved funny scenes from Wildstyle that I hadn't really even realized were that funny. They would stick into, I'd paint a dozen murals for some of that ass, which is a quote from Wildstyle, which they used in their record. So they were starting to quote Wildstyle a lot in their records, which I think people were like, oh yeah. It's hard to imagine how much this culture had disappeared. Really, for real. And it was really time to sort of, the DJs themselves were the keepers of the flame. They were the culture in hip-hop that were really paying attention to history. Right from the beginning, that was the DJ's job, to know what was and to bring it back to people and serve it up and make it new again. James Brown was popular because it got played. He got played on, Stereosonic made James Brown new again, so you have to see how the DJs were playing bits and pieces of older things and making it fresh. And so in the 90s, you had this, we're talking about the next decade, right? In the 90s, you had this slow emergence of some, like, people waking up as if from a dream and realizing that this thing that's supposedly everywhere, they're not even sure what the hell it is or where it came from or who did it, or, you know what I mean? It's sort of like if you brought up a bunch of children and they had no idea who their father and mother were. So anyway, in short, the film started to get, I started actually bootlegging the movie and selling it in VHS copies because it wasn't even in distribution at that time. I sold thousands of them through a little postage stamp in the back of the source, which was the way it kept out there. It was keeping going, but it's a tiny, it's a birthday candle next to a big furnace. Hip-hop culture, MTV, was not interested in anything except what they were selling next. And blah, blah, blah. Blah, blah, blah.
You know, it was about selling the next thing. And there was a moment there where it started to occur to people, and I was really thinking that anywhere that I would go around, I'd be like, man, all these people think that Wildstyle is like going back into the deepest history. And I was freaked out by the sense of the lack of sense of perspective that people had in this culture. And I started to sit down with everybody that I could and make an hour with each person and say, when was the first time you heard hip hop? Where was it? Who was in the room with you? What did it look like? What did it sound like? And this was, you know, Tony Tone, Grandmaster Caz, Busy Bee, Crazy Legs, you name it. I went down through 40 people and sat down sometimes in cars at 2 a.m. with a little tape recorder and made these tapes with this idea of wanting to find out from the real people before it all disappeared. There was no perspective.
You've been around, or you've been involved with, or people you've worked with?
Well, the most recent thing that happened to me, I was in Paris recently, and I was at a party because I had just shown this movie, Jamel Shabazz, which I'm showing tonight, and I also showed this movie that I'm showing tonight called Way of the B-Boy, which is another new film that I worked on, and we were at the party at the end of the festival, and this very tall, dark-skinned African guy approached me and he said, I got to tell you that your film ruined my life. And I'm like, why? What happened? He says, ever since I saw Wildstyle when I was a little kid, I'm a total graffiti head. And all I want to do is paint graffiti. And I'm like, okay, so would you paint walls? Because I hadn't seen that much on the subways. And he says, no, I hit trains. And I said, I'd like to see pictures. I'm a skeptic, you know. So I said, let's show me some pictures. He goes, no, I can't show you. I don't have any pictures. But I'm going to show you by taking you. Come on. We're going to go tonight. And he wanted me to go down into this system at 2 o'clock that night. And I was supposed to leave the very next morning to go back to New York. And all I can say was, as insane as it sounds, because I had never seen this guy before, I didn't know who he was, but I did go out, and you got to understand that the subways in Paris close at 12 o'clock, so nothing is running, and we met out in this neighborhood in the north of Paris. He started piecing trains, and I had with me this trusty little camera that I used to shoot film with, and we made a film together, and that was about a month ago. And that was a really cool experience. I'm really into hip hop as a movement, and you know, in terms of how it's redrawn the lines of culture and respect on this planet. I think it's really done a lot for people to understand creativity and how it works between people of different races and cultures and classes in this crazy world. And there's a lot of shit going on, and I'm not saying that hip-hop is an answer to the political things that are going on around the world, but I do think that it's immeasurably connected bridges between all sorts of people of different lines, different languages and cultures around the world, and I've seen it happen hundreds of times between people like this guy, other people from different cultures, you know, a Japanese guy with someone from Brazil, etc. This is what's happening on a daily basis, and it's used to be shocking, and it used to be something that we could tell a story about. It's not even a story anymore because it happens all over the world, and that's what it's about.
Excellent.
Thank you.
And thanks to Charlie Ahearn and Kevin Fitzgerald and Mickey Nine Fingers, and this is the Archivest, and you already know the name.